not in, Tony.
Hey, Wendy.
Guess I'm in.
There you go. Hey, Wendy, is Melissa joining by telephone or on the Zoom link?
I think she'll be joining via Zoom link.
Okay. Just trying to track who's on the screen here, what telephone numbers I don't recognize.
I understand.
There she is. Midget.
One more round, Bruce.
One more. I'm always impressed by the frequent flyers, that is the attendees who join all of our meetings. I see Liz is there, and there again, Liz, you're a glutton for it. And there's Drew, let's put him in.
Has the New Hampshire listens material, oh, listen, has that been, has that gone out yet?
What are you referring to?
I'm sorry, not New Hampshire listen, the census and survey.
The Granite State Poll survey?
Thank you.
Yeah, you dropped off that last call just after we mentioned that. My understanding is the third week in September is when that goes out. So I think it's coming right up. We'll confirm that right away.
Pretty soon.
Yep. Let me see here. Jordan is not available this afternoon. Oops, there's Robert.
Okay.
Let me just see if Robert's having an issue getting in.
Hey, Don.
I'm muted on the call. Oh.
Old friend.
Great to see you.
You too. It's always nice.
A former Hopkinson?
No, NHTI.
Aha. Great. Bruce, anything we are waiting for at this point?
Let me just try to get Robert in. I think, I assume this is his phone number here, 052. He said he was muted.
Yes, I received a text from him with the same message.
Okay. So let me just assume that his phone number ends in 052.
Well, we can Can initiate our meeting, do our attendance calls. Is that okay? Can you? Bruce is flying and
Yeah, I'm
leading us at the same time.
right. Thank you. Yeah, but go ahead, you can just go ahead and start with attendance and I'll take care of Robert here.
Good, thanks. All right, we'll call to order our final Commission on School Funding Work Group meeting of the day on adequacy and distribution. We have a regular group of attendees from the Commission that are part of this work group. So I'll just call the roll of that, of our membership and work around from my screen. Barbara?
Barbara here in Keene, husband in the other room. Hi, everyone.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi. Val?
Val Zanchuk's in his office in Jaffrey all by himself.
Thanks, Val. Good to see you. Jane?
Good afternoon, everyone. Jane Bergeron at my home alone here in Litchfield.
Thanks, Jane. Bill?
Hi, everybody. Bill Ardinger in Cuttyhunk. My wife is in the house with me. Thank you.
Hi, Bill. And Iris?
Hi. I'm home in Barrington. Husband somewhere around, but not in the immediate vicinity.
And I should have added, I am in Keene and on my own in this room anyway. Other folks from the Commission, I see Dick Ames.
Yes, I'm here in Jaffrey in my home alone.
And I see our Carsey team, part of our team, part of the Commission. Bruce?
Bruce Mallory and Kittery Point, home in my office, alone at home.
Thank you, Bruce and Carrie.
Hi, Carrie Portree. I'm in Dover, home by myself as well, taking notes.
Thank you, Carrie. And from our AIR team, I see Drew.
Hey, Drew Atchison in Washington, D.C.
And good. We, our focus today, at least initially, is to engage some of the state's English language learner experts from the field. And just as background, we have, as a work group, focused on the variety of areas that have either categorical or disparity aid in the school funding distributions by the state. In the case of English language learning, it is part of a disparity category that has a specific allocation in school funding on a per pupil basis that goes back to districts that have declared English language learners. So we know what that total dollar amount is, and it's escaping me right now. So there's a fact that you can drop on us and how much per student. But I think we also are curious about how students are identified for entry into the program, what kind of special services they receive, and that may differ on the concentrations of students that you may have in districts. And then finally, do students exit from the category and what's that criteria? And I'm just teeing up some questions that I know, Bruce, you also teed up some questions and maybe just for background to the commission members, any other questions that you had that the folks are going to address?
No, I think that in general, we're trying to get a sort of on the ground perspective here of how funds reach local districts to support English language learners And then once they do, how those funds are actually used, and how do we know that money makes a difference? Clearly, differentiated aid for English language learners has been part of the formula for a long time. The commission is interested in being sure that the weighting is correct to adequately provide the opportunity for an adequate education for English language learners. And so this is our opportunity to hear from folks working at the department level, at the school district level, and with English language learners in the community college system who have experienced our public schools to get a perspective on that as well. Let me just take a moment to say that I'm still trying to get Robert Chioppa from the Nashville School District in here. He sent me a note saying he was muted, but I don't see your name, Robert, on the attendee list in the sort of the waiting room for attendees. Otherwise, if I saw you there, I could bring you in. So I'm a little puzzled about what the block is there. But so just keep trying, and we'll try to get you in here as soon as we can. I know you've got your hand.
I sent him another message encouraging him to call back in.
Jay.
I have one hand raised here on a phone number that ends in 000, but I have two phone numbers that end in 000. So maybe the first one here, Robert, can you, is that you?
He said that's me in a return text, but I guess he must still be muted.
Yeah, which I can unmute there.
David, did you have something?
Yeah, Jay, you had asked what the...
How about now?
Yes, thank you.
All right,
Okay.
very good.
Ready to go. All
Sorry
right.
about that.
Jay, you were looking for the dollars, the ELL dollars from the model?
Thank you. Not so much the model as I wanted to look back at our current dollars that are a part of the disparity aid and the adequacy formula. I can look that up as we're getting into the flow of things, but maybe we should begin with Wendy. I don't know. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. No, I'm happy to start.
We'll get the Department of Education overview, and then we can get some feet on the ground.
Sure. Right. Hello, everyone. I'm
You've
Wendy.
got experience there, though.
I'm EL and Title III federal programs consultant for the Department of Education, and I've been in this role for approximately 4 months. Before that, I was in a position similar to Bob Chioppa, where I was the EL director for the Manchester School District for about 5 years. So I can certainly answer some of the questions about programmings and the process for identifying students and developing programs locally. And then I think Bob Chioppa would be the person to really speak to how they then use those funds locally to support English learners. And I think the number you're looking for is something around $750 per student for that differentiated aid for identified English learners.
Right, and total, I'll look up what I'm looking for, thanks.
Sure. But I mean, our role here at the DOE is to really help local districts and schools meet their obligations under federal law to ensure that ELs have equal access to high quality education and the opportunity to achieve academic potential. So we really provide leadership to ensure that they're identified, and I can unpack that process in just a minute, and then supported with effective programs to help them attain both EL proficiency, but also rigorous academic standards, and then identify any challenges with districts and help support, the local districts and schools with reform efforts to improve EL's experiences. So the students are identified through the general enrollment process. It's the federal law that all students who enroll in a school district are given what's called a home language survey, which really collects the linguistic environment in their home, whether or not they speak a language other than English at home. And if they identify that another language is spoken, that information is usually given to a New Hampshire certified ESOL teacher, who then administers an English language proficiency test. And depending on the student's performance on that test, they would qualify for English language support. And of course, that's a continuum. So depending on their level of English language proficiency, they would then be assigned to a language instruction educational program. And those really do vary by district. So in a place like Manchester or Nashua, where there may be a higher number of newcomer students at the beginning levels of proficiency, students may receive more intense services. That could mean they are pulled aside for small group direct instruction and also supported within the classroom by an experienced New Hampshire ESOL teacher with that specialized training. For students who have higher proficiency levels, they may just receive that embedded support in the classroom. So the program models can really differ depending on local resources and EL enrollment. And there really are no federal specific guidelines for the amount of time EL teachers have to spend with students or what the program must look like. There are certain models. There could be full bilingual programs, and there could be at the other end of the spectrum, as I just described, embedded services inside general classrooms for teachers. So it's really kind of a continuum of services. And students exit the program when they reach proficiency as defined within our state ESSA compliance plan. So we use a state adopted English proficiency screener. So after a student's identified as an English learner, every year they're required to take an English language proficiency exam, so we can make sure they're making annual progress as outlined in the state compliance ESSA plan. And when they reach proficiency, they then enter into what's called a monitor status for 4 years. And during that time, school districts are required at minimum to check in with students' teachers and make sure that language does not continue to remain a barrier and that students are progressing in their content or general classrooms without issue or chance of failure. So that really kind of summarizes how they're identified, the continuum of service models, and then how they exit. And I think, I can certainly pause for questions about that, but then I think Bob Chopa can speak a little bit more to how districts receive and then use some of the differentiated aid.
Are students continue as they go through that 4-year process of continued exam or attention? Are they still students counted as EL students by the school?
Yes, and we keep them on. So the state also maintains an ESOL database, and so I think I was just looking at our current numbers. We have currently in New Hampshire 4,845 what we call active students. So those are students who have not yet tested proficient and are still receiving direct instruction, direct language support. And then we have an additional 1,661 students who are on that monitored status. They have reached that level of proficiency on the test we give them. So they've exited the program, but we're still keeping them on our books for 4 more years of monitoring to ensure that they're really ready to move into those content classes without additional support.
So what we go, I'll save questions so that all the presenters can ask, can answer as you wish. Any other background questions here?
We got one.
Yeah, Bruce.
Wendy, are there dedicated federal dollars that come into at the state level to support EL?
So there's Title III money that can supplement EL instructional programs. So if districts have English learners, they would then qualify. I think this year, this is not the exact figure, but it's somewhere around $151 per student. And it's a per pupil allocation that districts are eligible for. And they can opt in or out of those federal programs to get that extra money, the Title III support.
Given what you know at this point, what's your sense of how many opt in? What's the level of participation and taking advantage?
I think currently we have about 35 districts in New Hampshire that opt in, and I would say the majority of English learners are served through some type of Title III program in the state.
Yeah, I'm sorry, what was that? How many?
Majority.
Around 35 districts currently, and I wish I had that figure for you. I could follow up with it, but it does cover a majority of the English learners in the state are also supported with supplemental funds through Title III.
Great. Good question. All right, seeing no others. Robert, could you introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Bob Chopa. I'm a Director of Student Services and the English Language Learner Program in Nashua School District. I'm starting my 21st or 22nd year here. I've been the Director of the ELL program for, I think, 15 or 16. It's been a while. And I guess I'm speaking, am I speaking to the adequacy funds that are related to ELLs?
You are speaking with the Adequacy and Distribution work group.
Okay.
I think Wendy addressed a number of the questions that we'd like your perspective on as well.
Wendy had a lot covered. From my understanding, the adequacy funds, they don't come to the district directly to the ELL program. They go to the city to offset the school, but the overall entire school budget. So if our school budget was, $100 million, and the adequacy funding came, let's say, of $1 million, that just goes directly to the city, and now the city's got to come up with 19 million. So it doesn't come directly to the ELL program to benefit the students.
Right. Well, why don't you describe in your school what the concentration of ELL students is in a diverse, you're certainly in Nashua, one of the more diverse districts among all of those in New Hampshire. And you could maybe describe for us by at least elementary, middle, high school, how students are and what kind of programming there is for students who are newly identified as ELL.
All right, gladly. Nashua is kind of more of it's less like the rest of New Hampshire and more like the rest of the United States in that we're very highly a Latino population. Our ELL program's about 1,400, almost 1,500 kids, and we're mostly Latinos, the population. If you look at our students overall, including that Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens, the majority of our students are born as U.S. citizens, born in Nashua or around the country and are here. It's about over 50% that are U.S. citizens. And then the majority of our students come from Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic. Those are the two big ones. The second group, which is much smaller, is Brazilian Portuguese. They make up about maybe 8% of the program. And then we also have, over the last 10 years, we've been receiving refugees from various African countries. And it's tough to paint a broad brush with ELLs because every experience and every kid is different. So it's hard to, as much as you say, yeah, they're all English language learners, they are, but there's so many different needs and experiences in that group that it's kind of difficult to describe them all as, one general population. But the way we service the students at the elementary level, we have a combination of pull out, which is the ELL teacher will take the student out of the classroom and for small group instruction, and we try not to take them out of the core areas of English, math. We want the students in the classrooms for that, so they can participate as much as they can. Sometimes they're taken out of specialists like art or whatever we can. Try not to disrupt their day as much as we can. Of course, the newcomers, kids that just arrive or have very little English proficiency, it's hard for them to participate in any of the academic situations that happen in the classroom. So there, it's less of an impact when we take those students out. We try to service them at least twice a day if we can. It's difficult with the staffing that we've had. We've had some issues in Nashua, which luckily over the last 2 years have been addressed by hiring more staff. So at the elementary level, it's that pull out, push in level. Push in is when an ELL teacher or an aide will go into the classroom and help those students as they're in the mainstream classroom, just try to help them with the vocabulary or just, the basic undergoings of what's happening in the classroom. Middle school students are scheduled. We have a schedule that's, I think we have 7 periods a day. Most of the students receive 1 period. I think that's 48 minutes of ELL instruction. Newcomers, we at least try to get 2 hits a day to get them in with the ELL teacher to receive the language proficiency instruction. And high school, we have block scheduling, which, 90 minutes. And for our newcomers, they get 2 blocks a day. So half of their day is in the ELL classroom, which is a pretty ideal situation for them. And we also have some ELL certified teachers that teach content classes. So ELL math, so to kind of give them the language of the content areas, ELL science. And, another aspect, we could talk about the times that we service the students, but a role that the ELL teachers play is, beyond what Wendy was talking about as a case management when the kids are monitored. A lot of them really operate as, they become almost like social workers for the families because they, become so involved with these students, and there are so many needs in those areas that they really, are getting the kids hooked up with, different programming around the city to help them. Sometimes you find them clothes or adequate, stuff for winter. They really are a dedicated staff that go above and beyond just your school day. It's really impressive to see how far some of these teachers go to take care of their kids and make sure that their families are covered as best we can.
And what about adult learners? Is that a part? It's not, I guess the funding is through a different means than through the adequacy aid reimbursement.
Well, we normally don't address the adult learners very much. We have the Adult Learning Center here in Nashua, which we collaborate with them a little bit because a lot of times the parents that are in those classes are the parents of the English language learners. But given the move to remote instruction, this really exposed a really rough situation for a good portion of our ELL population, in that they weren't quite proficient with the technology. So parents really couldn't help their students access their education when we went remotely, because just operating and trying to get operating the computer and going into Google Classroom, all of these things were foreign. So the way we've addressed that this year is we've partnered with the Boys and Girls Club, and I think Friday was our first night, and I think we either have another one tonight or tomorrow, where we invited the parents in along with their children, and are providing some digital literacy classes for them so they can help their children during the school day or whenever they get home from work with some of these programs that the kids are asked to perform on. And right now we're concentrating on grades 8 through 12. And we've had one Spanish night, and then we're going to have I think it's tonight is the Portuguese night, and then we'll have a Swahili night. And then we'll look at the programming, figure out what we need to make any adjustments, and if we have to expand it. And then the plan is to move it down to the lower grades, to the parents of those students. It really, this is a tough gig for our English language learning parents, the move to remote, because when you think about barriers, for an English language learner, your number one barrier is the language. And then, you know, you throw in the language, and now you throw in technology that they might not be accustomed to. And, you know, we got to do whatever we can to support this group, because it'd be easy for them to really fall behind.
And in terms of funding, I think that is one challenge for districts is keeping up with the language assistance programs and their obligation under Title VI law to provide parents with limited English proficiency, translation of information in a language that they can understand. And really under the law, any vital document, you know, related to student progress or academic concerns, health notices, has to be translated. And you can't really use the Title III supplemental funds from the federal government for that service, because it's the obligation of districts. So certainly districts with higher numbers of families with limited English proficiency, that is an added cost, and it can be quite expensive, particularly now when their information is changing so often, and you have to give parents lots of updates. I'm glad Bob mentioned that, because it really is, you know, I think something people continue to struggle with. It's a challenge, but they're also getting very creative. And I loved your example, Bob.
Wendy, Bob, can you just put some language to the Title III and Title VI? Do they have names?
You go ahead, Wendy.
Sure. Well, Title III is really the federal program to support English language learners. And then Title VI law is really civil rights law, and just ensuring that discrimination for US citizens, and this is relevant to healthcare too, that really is a protection against discrimination for natural origin. So making sure citizens are receiving vital information, again, that could be related to health or education in a language they can understand. That is protected under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And really Title III is a specific federal program, much like Title I, but to support English learners.
That's Title III of ESSA.
Title III of ESSA, yes, thank you.
I saw Iris had her hand up a while ago.
Oh, sorry.
Thanks. Won't surprise my colleagues. I'm going to ask about concentrations, because you mentioned that there were about 5,000 ELL currently identified receiving services statewide. And then we heard that there are 1,500 in Nashua. So given that we don't know the number for Manchester, but I'm sure it's also quite high, this is something that's screaming concentrations. And I'd like to just ask you to talk about that.
And I think the number in Manchester is 2,000, and you know, that is impacted by the U.S. Department of State and the equation they use to determine which communities in the United States will receive refugees in resettlement. And so, and I also think when there's a community established, as there is in Nashua, Latino community, community of Brazilians, they tend to support each other and move to that same area. So I think it's a couple of things, but yeah, we don't have much control over that concentration.
And it is a real challenge for the state, because the difference between, say, you know, Manchester and Nashua to, you know, English language learners that are north of Concord, it's a totally different experience for the educators. We have, you know, like I said, it's a concentration. So we have teachers that can hit a large number of students quite easily within one building. When you go to the low incidence districts up north, they're, you know, the teachers are traveling from school to school, and students have a very different experience as far as how much support they're getting from those ELL teachers. It's very, very different within the state.
So I'm in Keene, for instance, and clearly there are family members that are trying to assist their circle of family or friends to find jobs in our local area and relocate here. we don't have near the frequencies that you're identifying, but clearly there are students in need of EL services. So in that might be true in Hinsdale or in Swansea or other smaller districts then. So I mean there is a requirement to do the same list of services, Wendy, that you were describing, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
It can be a challenge in New Hampshire. There's a critical shortage of ESOL certified teachers. So, it does present a challenge.
Yeah. I know we've got lots of other questions. Dick, should we let Dawn go and then you get the first question? Okay. Dawn, fill us in.
So, hi everyone. I'm a certified ESL instructor in the state of New Hampshire. I'm currently working at NHTI. I've been there for about 20 years. And we have, Wendy had mentioned that students in the high schools will, be tested to see if they could exit the program or to be monitored. And that's usually my point of entry. I work very closely with the local high school, the Concord High School especially, although we work with other places too, to work with their language educators and their social worker there to figure out which kids are moving towards college and which ones have already been exited from a program. So the ones, and I ask them first off, have you been, when they come and see me, I ask them about their history, of language education in public school to make a better determination about and predicting some of what their needs are going to be when they reach community college. And one of my first questions is, have you been exited from a program? And even if they have been exited, I will, so I put on that kind of monitor hat because I know that there's still monitoring that needs to take place in order for students to fully participate in school and persist in school. We have students self-identify. So we have on our application, we ask students what their native languages are from the point of admissions. I know other schools in the community college system may do things differently. And then, so that's my, I'm connected a lot with our admissions office to help to kind of screen and support and advise the language learners that we have who self-identify. So we have a roughly, maybe a little over 600 self-identified language learners at NHTI, most of whom come from our local our region, upwards of, I guess, 65 native languages or so. It's a pretty decent cross-section of the community that we're hoping to serve. Our most prominent or our highest number of language learners at NHTI have Nepali as their native language from the, the recent waves of Nepali Bhutanese refugees. Probably 85% of our student body who self-identify as having a language other than English in the home or use another language. About 85% of them are the new American or the resettled refugee. So they do come to school with a variety of formal education, K through 12. Some of them have had some interruption in education in their formal education. So we're working. We have a lot of services that help students as they self-identify to kind of figure out how we can support them, not only with access to certain programs, access to services, but I think it's important, Wendy had mentioned too, and Bob as well, we really do a lot of case managing. So, persistence in school is, one part of it is language proficiency, but especially in this remote environment, there are many other layers of challenge that our newcomers face And those have to be evaluated in some ways. So, you know, we have students who are working on their computer literacy skills and their cultural literacy skills, you know, how to use the bus map and how to get good service at a mechanic and how to keep their car going and childcare needs. And, you know, so there are a lot of needs that are, one might think are completely separate from academics and, you know, scholastic goals for the whole family, but they're really all tied together. We have probably so we have the Nepali speakers. We also have, of course, Spanish, but that's kind of neck and neck with Arabic and Swahili and Kinyarwanda. Of course, we also have a large group of Portuguese speakers from Brazil. We have many refugees who come from Somalians, so refugee camps in Kenya from having escaped from Somalia. So we have a very, I guess, a big cross section, and their needs are different. Some of their needs are the same, but some are different. I can answer questions.
Well, thank you. Is Concord a resettlement identified by immigration naturalization?
Yeah, so what happens is when newcomers come into our communities, they're typically settled in what are called primary cities based on things like resources, another, you know, a population of language, you know, a population of people who are already from that culture and language there. And then we have secondary cities once the primary cities have reached a certain number of resources and so on. So Concord, so International Institute in Manchester is the non-governmental resettling agency in, I think, the lower tier of the, you know, Manchester and lower. And there may be another in Nashua, maybe Bob could help with that. But in Concord, we have Accentria, formerly Lutheran Social Services, who, and I have contact with them all the time because, you know, we have a lot of students who come to us over the age of 21 and can no longer receive services through K through 12, and have needs, but also come in with, you know, degrees and transcripts. And I try very hard to support this new community, to not having to start at the beginning, but just to continue where they are. So
Don,
mm-hmm.
for the districts with low EL counts, which, you know, looking across the sort of 200 plus cities and towns, that's the bulk of those towns. How are districts doing as far as I guess, number one, providing the specific services they need for those students, but also some of the you know, I don't want to call it, well, I guess it's sort of wraparound services, the case management, but also some of the administrative things like translating. I mean, our superintendent here in Hopkinton sends out community notices 2 or 3 times a week. Are they all getting translated?
So this is a great question. It's kind of a political question too, in some ways, because it is true that the state of New Hampshire is low incidence. So we do have these pockets with higher density of language learners along the 93 corridor, that's for sure.
Yeah.
For, you know, the teachers that I work, our colleagues who are working in low incidence towns, they do this thing that Bob describes, like going from school to school. It's an effort. My understanding is that the State Department of Ed supports schools based on the numbers of students that they have. All students are supposed to get an equitable access to education, but like Wendy had mentioned, the models that are used will look very different. So, you know, you may have in a high density district, say like Manchester, you have something called sheltered content where you have an ESL teacher, you know, it'd be, you know, and maybe some co-teaching with another content area, like a science class with only ESL students in that class. That would be your sheltered content. And that seems reasonable because you have the numbers. But then, you know, there are different, you know, if you only have 2 ELLs in an elementary school, you know, to have them be in their own sheltered content class, they don't have the benefit of addressing Schumann's theory of social distance. They need to have language learning takes place much more effectively and faster when you're actually included in the host community and not just kind of segregated for safety in a wing somewhere. So, you know, I think resources play a role, the number of kids you have in a school. And, you know, I think that the school's philosophy about how things should happen plays a role too. Not that that is, you know, it's kind of a work in progress for all of us. There are some programs that support students, and students are different too. So I don't know if Wendy had any more info on that, like low incidence, you know.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I agree with what you said. I think that threshold, just to help people contextualize that, is 20% or more is considered high incidence by the federal definition. Mid incidence is 5 to 20%, and then anything less than 5% is low incidence. So even in Manchester, with the highest number, around 2,000 identified English learners, I think that's still just around 13 or 14% of their overall enrollment. So that's still, you know, by definition, not a high incidence district.
Right. Yep.
So follow up on that. When looking at some of the districts that have the high incidence, or, you know, higher than other parts of New Hampshire, so Manchester, Nashua, we've sort of talked about those. Are there one of the things that I think this work group is exploring is the effect of concentration on the estimated cost model, and I think I've learned that like with respect to certain certain differentiated aid categories like free and reduced lunch, concentrations tend to lead to could lead to higher costs. Did I get that right, Jay?
Well, I think that is our debate, or just the question that the commission's had in front of it is, on a per student basis, does a district that has higher concentration have higher costs per EL student, or are the costs comparable, just the programming is different? And I guess if each of you might posit, you know, your thoughts on that, that would be helpful, just to frame different perspectives that you might have. Are the costs per student different if you've got a concentration versus the smaller isolated populations?
Bob, maybe you're best to answer that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that probably the lower incidence, you just can't afford to put resources into a smaller group of folks because there's just so many needs all around. So I couldn't imagine. I mean, in the lower instance, those people are traveling because there's not a teacher in each building servicing that lower number of kids. So, you know, just kind of talking this through as I'm thinking it, I think that the costs are going to be higher in a higher incidence group. Just here, you know, we have 34 teachers, so that's a significant. You include benefits into all that. That's a pretty significant number right there. Then a lower incidence where, you know, you're just one teacher is just going to be spread real thin through a lower number of students. So yeah, I would think the costs are more significant in the higher incidence districts.
Could I, Jay, could I ask Iris to just ask about the concentration point right at this point where you're talking about it? She's had this concept, and I'd love to hear her views on what concentration means and what she thinks it leads to. I think he just put his
finger on it. As far as the ELL goes, I think he just put his finger on it. You know, a child who's in a school where they're one of 2 ELL students doesn't get the same kind of pull-out services, but on the other hand, benefits from being integrated more fully into the English environments. And I think that's a different way to go about learning a second language. So I'm not sure. I understand that in some sense, the lower incidence might have higher costs, but I think the higher costs associated with concentrations are very real. And I think he just described them.
Did you think that those costs kind of get absorbed into the other case management and the kind of student services that the smaller districts, lower incidence schools have?
Yeah, that they can't afford to provide to 1 or 2 students. When you have a high concentration, it makes more sense to try and address all of those needs that have been described that are associated with learning a new language in a new place, in a new culture. And so I think it's much more complicated than the language itself. And the districts with high incidence can pool students and provide them with the services that are needed in that kind of environment. They live in a different environment than the child in the district where they're one of 2. They live in a different milieu.
We're 20 and 40. But I guess what I'm wondering, that the case manager, I mean, case management has become a huge cost in every school district, whether that's a poverty index or a special needs students, at any rate. I mean, the families coping with those things. So I'm just, is the overall expense on a per kid basis comparable? It's just absorbed differently into the school. I was just throwing that out. I don't know that anyone can answer that one.
And I think it is pretty complex. I mean, I like the point that Iris made about, so their needs are being met in the integration in the classroom, but to varying degrees, that classroom teacher may or may not, in their teacher preparation program, had training to specifically support English language learners. And if they haven't, then the amount of support they're providing might be adequate in that moment, but over the longevity of that student's experience, it might not have accelerated their language development in a way it would with a teacher who's had that specialized training. And then if the teacher in a low incidence district, they still have to provide that support. If they're hiring a teacher to travel within their district, it's not necessarily an efficient use of resource, although they have no other choice. So that travel time is time that they cannot spend in front of students. So, as is everything with education, I think it's just there's so many variables and it's so complex. The work you're doing is tough.
Wendy, do you have that list of 35 schools
who are receiving Title III support?
Yeah.
Yes.
That might be helpful for us to compare against, some of the projection models. Dawn, you've got your hand up. I'm sorry. Dick, you're next.
Yeah, I just wanted to, this might not be the right place to say it, or it might not be a popular thing to say even, but from my experience as an ESL teacher, one of the best ways that, for the future of ESL in New Hampshire, in any environment, whether it's high incidence, medium, or especially low, is to encourage educators to become dual certified. So, there are other states that have, like California, every content teacher has some certificate and some knowledge base that's chunky enough that for ESL. And so I liken this to, wouldn't it be wonderful if we had educators who are all also dual certified in special education? Because let's face it, good teaching is good teaching. Good strategies are good strategies. What, a strategy that helps the quietest, most introverted ESL student is certainly going to help a native speaking student, et cetera, et cetera. And I just mean that, if we had at least a person or two in every school who was dual certified, or at least on the way to being dual certified, as some teachers are already doing, that could help with cost in the long run, in terms of having, your rural ESL teacher with, art on a cart, meaning in her car, traveling miles and miles with all of her equipment to support that. So.
Got it. Dick?
Yeah, thank you. So I was going back to the adequacy funding, and the current formula provides extra funding for English ELL students. And so I want to get a better handle on the identification of ELL students. I think I have a sense of when they become that. It's a testing process, an identification and testing process. And then, yes, they need ELL services. And so they're on a list or whatever, they're counted. And I'm less clear on when they come off. You mentioned monitoring. Someone did. There's a sort of a stage that happens after the regular service stage. Are the monitored students still ELL students? And then a related question to all this is, how long are students likely to be ELL students, starting with a young kid, assuming you've got years of time in the school system?
I think from an official language and identification standpoint, once students have reached that exit proficiency, they've tested out, but on the state English language proficiency test, and they've exited, they're officially not active English learners anymore. They've then moved into monitor status. However, they do remain on our books. And the federal law says that at minimum, states must keep students in monitor status for 2 years. In New Hampshire, in our ESSA plan, we decided to keep students in monitor status for 4 years.
And before that, how long is a student likely to be pre-monitoring, identified, and still getting services?
So the state long-term goal for EL progress is 5 years to reach from when they're identified to reaching English language proficiency. So that's the goal within our state ESSA plan. And so that's the measure. If you've looked at data on the I platform, that's the measure of adequate progress that you'd see reported there.
Right. And I think that question touches on kind of what I was talking about, the diversity of students that we get. So if you have a student who comes from a background where they are literate and they've had schooling, they can transfer their academic skills over to learning a language, and they might even already have the content and just not the language. So those students can just concentrate on learning the language, and they're already comfortable with the content. That student is going to probably pick up the language much more quickly than a student who's coming with either years of missed education or just gaps in their education, or a student who's even born in the United States who speaks another language, in Nashua's case mostly Spanish, but is not literate in Spanish. They've never had schooling to read or write in Spanish, so they don't have those skills to transfer over. And those students, a lot of them end up being what we call long-term English language learners. So it just shows there's so many different kind of there's a lot of variables in the different English language learners that we service.
Yeah, I've got one question, and then probably we're going to need to move along on our agenda. This is fascinating, and
we do
covering an area I think that we in the commission have not been as familiar with. So it's been really helpful. And then Jay, you can decide how you want to handle the rest of the agenda. But my question is for any of you, how many students who are receiving, who are active ELL students, would also be identified as eligible for free and reduced lunch and or special education services? So another way to ask that question is, what's the overlap in sort of special populations that are eligible for differentiated aid? When we think about, when we start with English language learners, how many of those are also perhaps receiving free and reduced lunch subsidy and or special education support? And that may be a hard number to count, but at least in
yeah. And this is Melissa White with the Department of Education. I'm the administrator for academics and assessment. And those particular numbers can be, I think, requested from our, a data request would have to go to Diana Fenton to provide exact numbers. And so if the group could submit the request to Diana Fenton, then she would be able to execute that process. But Wendy or I, we don't have that data information.
Yeah, and Melissa, you know, sometimes there can be a challenge there around issues of confidentiality and what data has to be suppressed to protect confidentiality. So we may not be able to go that route efficiently. I guess I'm looking for sort of an impressionist practitioner's view of what that degree of overlap is. Bob or Wendy, given your experience.
In Nashua, I think, I don't think I've obviously even run it this year. I think for duly identified ELL and special education, I think it's close to the district average, which I think is between 16 and 18, 16 or 18%. Mm-hmm. I had asked our I4C coordinator about the free and reduced lunch, and I'm going to have to get back to him because I don't think the numbers that he sent were accurate. I would think that just off the, a guess, I would assume it's got to be near 60 to 70% maybe. But again, if you have the numbers from the state, they'll be a lot cleaner than a guess off the top of my head.
And can I just follow up on Bruce's question? That was a question that I was going to raise in terms of the numbers of EL kids who are identified as having an educational disability, getting a sense of that, as well as some of the related costs, not just to educate, but even just to identify them as a child with a disability, ranging from the assessments and getting appropriate, assessors or evaluators who speak multiple language, to getting the information translated, to getting translators at the meetings. It would be great to have a sense of what those related costs are when it comes to kids with disabilities.
Right, and we do, you have to pay a bilingual evaluator if you, under IDA law, you must administer that special language assessment in the language most likely to yield accurate results. And those costs could be several $100s per administration, and to translate an IEP, even in a kind of summative reduced form, so parents are really kept in the loop, could be between $600 and $1,000. It's a pretty extensive document, and I think districts can often satisfy that obligation by talking parents through it and writing some, holding a conference with an interpreter and making sure that they're writing notes in the parent's first language. There's a number of ways to make sure parents are kept informed, but there are definitely additional costs.
It would be interesting to see some of that information over time and how much that has grown over maybe the past 5 years.
Is that available, Wendy?
I think you'd have to ask at the district level for that kind of data on spending.
Not something you've seen. I should, at this point, take Bruce's lead there and say a huge thank you to Wendy, Robert, and Dawn. That's just great insights into part of the education the kind of student needs that are presented in schools and how schools are addressing that to various degrees, and really appreciate learning more about the ELL needs and services that are provided in the state. Thank you very much.
And Melissa,
Very welcome. Glad you found it helpful. Have a great day.
Thank you, and thanks for the work you're doing.
Yeah, thank you, Wendy.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dawn. All right, moving to our next topic. At the last full commission meeting, we were talking with Drew and reviewing the AIR final draft report. And not attached were Z-scores, the compilation of various outcome measures that were used to as part of AIR's analysis. So Drew, Bruce, through your services that we accessed or were sent to us the composite scores that were used by AIR, and I think we need to at least spend a moment to say, yeah, we've looked at this. This presents something of value and is a means for us to convert very diverse measures into some uniform index that can from which outcomes can be determined relative to statewide averages. And Drew, I don't know if you want to do any further explanation on that or just field some questions that maybe work group members have.
Yeah, I mean, it's up to you. Do you think it would be helpful to just walk through the different elements on the spreadsheet and explain what each one is, or I'd be happy to just take questions as well?
Yeah, folks, I'll take a gauge of the members. Bill, did you have a feeling?
Let's do just questions, I think.
Yeah, good. I think that works for me.
Jay, do you want me to share the screen with that spreadsheet just to remind people of what's there?
If you can monitor what hands go up, sure.
I'll do that for a minute just to make sure everybody's looking literally on the same page.
Literally. Let's look at Allentown again.
So
it is the first one.
So if you have questions, speak out while we have you on a smaller screen.
Ardinger has a question.
Go, Bill.
What? You're surprised. Now, what's interesting about this sheet is I sorted the outcome factor score in C by smallest to largest. And you will end up finding the 5 plaintiff towns in the first 15 rows of the table. As well, you'll find Manchester, Nashua, and Concord, as larger areas. So this outcome factor score is kind of throwing off a ranking of need that seems to pass the practical experience test of New Hampshire in a way. Drew, my question about this outcome factor score is how your modeling used it to inform your step 1, step 2, step 3 process, and how, I guess I'll start with that.
Yeah. So the outcome factor score was one of the variables included in the step 1 cost model. So essentially what we do is include that as one of the predictors of spending. And then we also include the different cost factors, the student needs variables, FRL, EL, special education, the grade variables, and then the district size. And when we predict spending based on the outcome model, we set that outcome factor score to the state average. So we're saying if all districts were able to achieve the average outcome factor score, which is 0, what would their spending look like, or what would their spending be, assuming that their other characteristics remain what they are. And so we're basically holding that outcome factor score at a constant level and allowing the other factors, the relationships between the other factors and spending after controlling for the outcome factor score to drive the differences in predicted costs across districts. So that's why we see, that's why in step 2, when we estimate weights, we don't have to include the outcome factor score anymore because it's already set at a constant level. So in step 2, we're just predicting, we're just using the predictions from the first stage to look at what is the variation in those predictions with respect to free and reduced price lunch, English learners, special education, district size, and grades to estimate those weights. So we don't have to account for the outcomes anymore in the step 2 because we've already controlled for that in step 1.
So, right. So the column in your simulated model, where you had the relative costs, or the cost per pupil, for example, Manchester being 21 or 22,000, and the cost per pupil for another community being 14,000. Those per pupil dollar numbers are generated through the relationship among those communities. The fact that Manchester is slated as a higher per pupil cost than other towns that have better outcomes, I guess. That the reality is that this outcome factor score is really driving the relationship among communities. More so, and then you can put weights, use weighting of different types of students to get to the same ranking, the same relationship, but the fundamental relationship springs from this analysis. Is that right, accurate, or not?
Not exactly. So the outcome factor score is really going to drive the overall spending in the state. So in the simulator, when you set a higher outcome factor score as the target, you're going to increase cost overall in the state. If you set a lower outcome factor score, you're going to decrease the cost overall in the state. The differences in cost across districts really stem from the differences in student needs and district size and grade levels. But of course, there are also relationships between the outcome factor score and those student needs in particular. And so by including the outcome factor score in the first stage model, the relationship between FRL and spending accounts for the outcome factor score. And so that's why you see a positive relationship between FRL and spending in the outcome model, or in the education cost model, whereas if in the equity model, we see a flat or negative relationship between FRL and spending. So there's a covariance between the outcome factor score and FRL and special education. So by accounting for the outcomes, you're predicting your prediction or that relationship for FRL assumes that you have to achieve the same outcome. So obviously a higher FRL district is going to cost more to achieve the same outcome than a lower FRL district. So there's lots of different relationships all happening at the same time. But when you're talking about the relationship between student needs and spending, when you include for the outcome factor score, that's different than the relationship between student needs and spending when you don't include for the outcome factor score.
Bruce, I want to ask you to put up page 66 of their report, if you could.
You know what? I'm going to make Drew the
okay.
co-host here.
Then I just think if you would, I think that puts into context the amount of weight. It's answering Bill's question. It puts into context the amount of weight in the simulator that is from the outcome score. And it is almost entirely mitigated by the student need variables. And that, just trying to put a short synopsis to what Drew just said. And I think it's in page 66.
Yeah, I just tried to pull up page 66 and my Adobe froze and wasn't showing any text. So let me try again here.
Iris, I see your hand. Maybe we fill the space with a thought.
My thought?
Yeah.
My thought was exactly what Bill was talking about. I think it's unbelievable, and I was really glad to hear he did that ranking, and it came out the way it struck me it would come out. It was almost like you could take this score, and anything that was negative would show you where you needed to direct resources, almost without having to do all this other costing, because it was so, I mean, on a relative basis, you need to do something to tell you what the numbers will be, but on a relative basis, as I think is what Bill was trying to say, if I'm not putting words in your mouth, Bill, this is like so clear a measure of where the needs are that it seems like it should almost be a shortcut to deciding where to put resources somehow.
In fact, Iris, just these numbers and the rankings were shockingly similar to Governor Rich's index plan that he put together.
Oh, well,
no, understood. But it was stacked the same way. And maybe later, if you want to share the screen with the ranking, it's remarkable, if you've lived in New Hampshire, how the ranking seems to hit the mark exactly the way you just said.
Yeah.
So it's as you said, both of you, it's a litmus test, essentially, to how well the model is fitting previous studies that have been done, right?
It is.
And this one.
The one thing I'm concerned about is I have read the report carefully. I have tried to think about this, but we're running into complexities that, there seem to be, it's not something that's easily explained to the public.
Right.
How the outcomes and performance measures are translating into the dollars per pupil that inform the step 2 process. You kind of like you say, okay, here's step 1, but we're in step 2, we're going to go to weighting per pupil, but we're going to fit the results to match the results of step 1, which is based on outcomes and performance and quality. And I think that I'm just struggling to encourage something that explains it clearer and cleaner so that the public could resonate to it.
And I think we can.
I'm really glad you said that, because I've tried to explain this to a couple of friends who are really knowledgeable and have followed this, and I have a hard time explaining the leap from the averaging outcome to the spending piece. And if I can't express it to someone else, then I'm clearly not understanding it, even after all of these discussions. And while Drew's explanations make total sense statistically, they don't they don't logically flow in a way that I can explain this to anybody. And if I can't do that, and I'm glad to see other people shaking their heads.
Yeah, I'm in that same boat, Iris.
Somehow so that it's explainable.
And I think I can do that. But Drew, put up page 66 just so that we stay in the weeds for a moment, and then let's back up and try and get to that level of explaining the tiered approach and how the outcome measures tie back to student need and spending. Drew?
Is that it?
Sharing. Is this what can you see what I'm sharing?
Yeah, I mean, let me try to do this one. So you got to get back to page 66. It's in Appendix B, and to me, this is the regression model that's being used, and what it's showing is that when you put student outcomes are derived from various student need characteristics and school demographics. That's the outcome score. That's so the outcome score, though, when you put it into a spending model, doesn't have as much weight because outcomes are dependent. Graduation rates, attendance, achievement scores are very much related to student need characteristics. And these weights that you see in the regression model here are telling you what is influencing spending needs to get to an outcome score. And you can see that the outcome factor, when it's in all of those outcomes, are really mitigated by these student need characteristics. Not all, I'm sorry, but a good amount, right? There's a great relationship between student needs and outcome scores, right?
Yeah, that's kind of what we ended off with in our commission meeting. We saw those strong relationships between student outcomes and or student needs and the student outcome factor score. So yeah, I mean, you're right, certainly right that there's a lot of overlap between particularly these student needs variables and the outcome factor score. But so, and what this is saying, this is the regression that Jay is talking about. So an increase in student outcomes increases your costs. So this is a log linear model, but these can be interpreted as percent. So an increase, a 1 standard deviation increase in student outcomes will increase your cost by about 17.8%. Holding the outcomes constant, a 100% increase in free and reduced price lunch will increase your costs by 69%. Holding all other things constant, a 100% increase in special education will increase your costs by 167%. So I mean that's what the model does. So when you account for student outcomes in the model, you're essentially holding it constant. And so you can isolate the relationship between these other variables while holding student outcomes constant.
Can we go back to our panel frame?
Yep.
I think we've
Sure, you can close
that as deep as we needed to.
And so I just, back to getting this in our own, more lay language, Drew was just saying, will increase the cost. And to finish that sentence, it's to increase the cost so that all students can achieve a statewide average of performance as measured by achievement tests, graduation rates, and attendance rates. That's the that's the holy grail here that we have both backed into and, you know, staked out in terms of defining an outcomes-based cost model. And that is achieving what we all recognize is a relatively high bar or average high level of performance in our state. All of this, I think, helps set up the next round of conversation, which is, are we as a commission, or at least as a work group, going to recommend to the full commission that we continue this line of this policy analysis, which shifts from an input-based to an outcome-based cost model.
Bill, Iris, and others who haven't expressed their confusion or agreement or question. Yeah, go ahead, Bill.
No, I've spoken. You're right. I'm happy to hear others.
Yeah. Iris, any follow-up to that?
No. I'd like to hear from others also.
Well, Barbara.
Mary's raising.
That was helpful. Thank you very much. I've looked at this, and I think that I'm all set. And then I look at all the differences. We have to make sure we cover the disparities in the number of areas. And then I just panic a little bit. Well, if we did this, if we did that. So keep going over this was very helpful again today. I did see the correlation as well, Bill, that you had done. I had done the same thing. Here it is. And looked at that. It was very interesting work. So I think it's every time we talk about it, it becomes clearer. And as we look at the disparities or other issues we need to consider, I put that in my little list. And just want to make sure that we can do something that is equitable, take care of some of these disparities. It's what I think we have to do. So I'm not hung up on it. I just want to be very watchful. That's all. Thank you.
Mary had her hand up. Val.
Well, Val can go first. He's on the committee. I'm just kind of jumping in here.
No, you go ahead, Mary.
Okay, I just want to say that, as a lifelong educator, I think we're all looking for outcomes. And I think this model as presented really promotes, like they've been doing in Maryland. If you've been watching the legislation that they've been promoting in Maryland, that's what they're looking for. Our goal is to bring all kids, to give all kids those opportunities. And in order to do that, this process has identified a methodology seemingly pretty sound, that really points to those areas most in need and what is it that we need to do to get those kids up to the level of the average in the state. As former deputy commissioner, I used to look at the scores constantly, and I used to think, oh, if only Manchester could get to the average of the state, I'd be so happy. But these are things that we've been talking about for so long, and I have to say, I'm very excited about listening to everything today, because finally, I think things are coming together in terms of what Mel and David and so many of us have been talking about for so long, that this is coming together to say, this is what we need to do in order to bring forward the needs of those individuals and school districts that need the help the most. So that's just my little comment, and I'm saying yay, yay, sounds great to me, and I hopefully we'll move in that direction.
Thanks, Mary. Val?
Yeah, I think sharing Iris's frustration at trying to explain this to others. I know several months back we talked about needing a narrative. And I think that's going to be pretty important here, because it's going to be hard for not only the general public, but the legislature as well, to absorb the weeds associated with the depth of this report. And we run the risk of just having people throw their hands up in frustration trying to understand it. So I think it's incumbent upon us to really have a very clear story that goes with this that can always use the report as a reference point. But if we try to challenge everyone to use the report as the basis for their understanding, I have a feeling it's going to be difficult to capture people's true understanding of it. So there really needs to be a very, I think, a difficult process for us to try to distill this to a description that people can say, yes, this makes sense. And if they want more detail, the detail is there in the report. But we're going to be challenged to distill this to something that's really understandable to someone on a first reading that says, yep, this makes sense. And it corresponds to what, we as individuals have seen over the years, and it all comes together, and it's the aha moment that, gets everybody on board.
Thanks, Val. I see Mel's got his hand up. Jane, did you want to jump in with a work group comment, or yielding to Mel? Mel, take it away.
Yield to Mel for now.
Okay. Well, I'm with what Val has said as far as developing a scenario that's understandable. This approach is a fundamental shift. A fundamental shift in how we look at how we're going to try to provide opportunities for kids across the state that haven't had it before. I mean, the idea of dealing with an outcome-based, I think also addresses some of the issues that was made reference in some of the court suits here. And I think that's why I think this is such a dynamic approach to looking at this. And it is going to be a difficult sell, because we are looking, for some people, we are going to be looking at kids who have not been looked at before. And I think this is a way we need to go. It's not going to be an easy row to hoe here, but I think we've got the data that's there that cannot be denied. Kids are not getting equity in this state. That's the message. Now, some may say, yeah, it's there, they chose to live in that town. This data doesn't say that anymore. And I'm excited about this. I mean, I think it's finally, in my mind, I don't understand all the graphs. I don't understand all the appendices, but philosophically, this is what we need to begin to look at, I think.
Yep. Jay, can I follow Mel just quickly on his point with something?
Yep.
Mel, when I think about this, number one, I wholeheartedly agree with you. But when I think about this, the way that New Hampshire has been looking at determining adequacy in the past on an input basis is kind of saying, is your library good enough? The way this proposes to look at adequacy is, are your kids in your district reaching an achievement outcome that shows that they're getting a fair shake? In other words, and this is, my wife informs me, who's on the NEASC-NECHI accreditation for 6 years, that's exactly where accreditation is going as well, from inputs to outcomes. And I think that the way I really think about it is, the old way is looking at what kind of library do you have, what kind of teachers do you have. The new way is looking at how are your kids faring in terms of performance and outcomes in every district. And to me, that's the narrative for the shift here. It's defining adequacy not as input dollars, this plus this plus this technical issue plus this hallway plus this class size ratio. It is measuring the outcome. And to me, that's the real difference here. It is very challenging, though, to think about, having gone through this for 30 years in legislative settings, how to explain to someone from Cornish, where I have a house, where my family, where I grew up, why their number is less than another place, you know, in terms of technical detail. That's harder. But the concept, I think the narrative is easier. And I think it makes all the sense in the world for, as one member, to move in that direction.
Yeah, what I see too is that our constitutional requirement is the opportunity for an education. And this is putting weights to what the opportunities are to bring all kids up to an average outcome in the state. The opportunity, I think the opportunity is such an important word to what the outcome-based model is about, as opposed to just an adequate education, which is depending on the input measures. Next, who?
Val had his hand up, and then
Jane, we haven't come back to you.
Rick has his hand up too.
I see. We got 3 people. Jane, you want?
Great. You know, philosophically, I'm right there, and I think the equity issue is huge, and I think that that is our narrative. As we look at special education, I also want to make sure that as commission members, we are confident that we have really looked at the data related to the costs, everything from, you know, the court involved kids to the amount of money that we're paying the public school districts in regards to special education for our charter schools, the specialized transportation, the out of district kids, the kids with mental health and issues that oftentimes are falling into the bin of special education. Just not sure that we have taken and dug deeply into that to look at the real data. In many instances, we've been told it's not available. I would question that a little bit further just to make sure that we're very grounded, that we have looked at all of that information in depth, and when questioned would have information to back us up.
Yeah, I think Drew has, and we have a paper from AIR on that topic. And there are generalizations, no doubt, in this report, Jane, that because of the limitations on the data that we received from the Department of Education, don't give us as much detail to answer those questions. We know the number of special education students, but we can't break it down into these discrete categories that, and it's something for us to note about future data collections and how to mitigate against the confidentiality concerns that they had in disclosing that information to us. Drew, any follow-up to that?
No, I mean, I think finding that detailed data on costs of specific types of special education students would help bolster our finding if we could find that and it aligned with our estimated weight. But I think the way that the model works is taking total spending in the district, not broken down by whether that spending is for special education or EL or any particular type of student, and saying just in general, what does it cost for this district that has this amount of special education students to achieve the statewide average outcome? So our model, unless we had that more detailed data that we could plug into our model on specific types of special education students, we could estimate multiple weights for special education students, but with what we have, we can only estimate a single weight for special education student, and that weight tells us on average how much more a district needs per special education student to achieve a given outcome. And how that special education money is then spent by the district is kind of up to the district, whether that's spent on special education transportation, out of district placements, different types of EL or special education services. We don't know, but we're saying that they should get this amount of money to serve their special education population.
Thanks,
so Drew, as we look at the data and we think about, let's just take the 3 to 5 year old population of kids with disabilities that school districts are responsible for, and taking a look at the numbers of those students from the past 5 years, the cost for those kids, not only to educate, but to transport them. Are we confident that we looked at that? And then again, at the population of kids 18 to 21, which are also the responsibility of a school district?
We are using total spending in the district per the DOE 25 forms that, from my understanding, should be a comprehensive estimate of district level costs, inclusive of all costs that they have to pay for special education students, whether that's transportation or adult services. And then we are dividing that cost, overall cost, by the number of students in a district, inclusive of pre-K students and inclusive of, well, I'm not even sure if the data, I'm not sure if the data we had included adult students.
It does. It will because they haven't graduated.
Yeah.
The population
Okay.
changes.
Yeah. So we're dividing that overall cost by the number of total students to come up with a per pupil spending for the district. And then we're using that total spending that's inclusive of all costs to estimate the differences in costs across districts according to the needs that they have. So I think that I'm confident that the costs that we're identifying are the comprehensive costs that districts incur.
That's great to hear. So, that makes me feel a little bit more confident when we're questioned by the field in regards to specific populations like that.
Good, thanks. So Val, Rick, and Dick, different topics?
Yeah, it's the same thing here, just in terms of the outcomes here. I think one thing we need in our narrative, we may not be able to quantify it completely, but certainly qualitatively, the economic outcomes of a equitable education system in terms of employees that are capable of doing the jobs that are going to be there in the future. If we're going to try to meet the 65 by 25 goals, we have to have people coming out of the school who can continue into the training that's required to meet those economic needs. So I think there's a compelling economic interest of the state to have students, and you can certainly tie companies having difficulty hiring people with the schools that have the negative numbers on that outcome. So I think you would find a lot of support from the business community if you would be able to explain what the impact of this would be on the pool of potential employees they have in their geographic area if all of these outputs could be raised. And I think that has to be sort of a long range, at least from my perspective, very long range target, because this is just not education in some sort of abstraction. It's what is the impact of this education on the state and its needs in the future. And as we have a declining demographic of school-age students, the need for those students to be well prepared is incredible, because even if every student graduating from New Hampshire were brought into the workforce capable of contributing, we would still not satisfy the 65 by 25 demand. So it's anything that we lose off of that is just going to hurt the economics of the state. And I think we need to make that as part of the argument of why this is so important from a statewide basis, and why people can't put their educational community into silos and say, I just care about this and don't care about that. We should have a legislature and a governor saying this is critical to the economic well-being of the state in the future.
Thanks for the big picture, Val. And I think you're teeing up for Mel and Carrie what would be helpful for our final report from their public engagement circles, that they're gonna, maybe we can get that without doing extra work. Rick, you had...
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jay. I'm going back to your favorite chart here, Jay, page 66.
It is.
What I'm concerned about, and I love the way we're seeing the weighted formula applied for our students here. I'm concerned, probably as Jane is too, that we have special situations in our smaller schools, especially when they're more rurally located. And I can recall a situation, I was working with a superintendent of schools here in Haverhill about 6 years ago. And we had a school that had a child that needed speech pathology. And that school did not have a speech teacher. And the only way we could get a speech teacher and we needed that speech teacher, it was and not necessarily having the instruction taught through a para, but through the direct services of that teacher. We had a contract with a person out of Concord. We ended up having to pay the transportation of that individual up to this small school to provide that service 3 days a week. And that was a huge cost. And I don't know how we're going to cover that cost in some of our small schools. And my second question is, or need, I guess, for more definition, is in our enrollment categories. When we're at $200 or less, that lower category right there, we have a number of schools which fall in the categories that are below 125. And that's where your costs start to skyrocket on a per capita, basis. And I just hope our formula is going to help. And we have a lot of schools in that category in the state. And to avoid the waterfall effect, going from one of these categories to another, and this is where Dave Luno and I worked last year on a funding formula where we wouldn't have the waterfall effect from one category to another. We slid gradually. If I move from a 200 to a next category up, there's going to be a waterfall effect. Can we fix this so that a school's not going to really be hammered when their population changes? And we have population changes going rapidly because of decline of enrollment in the state.
Yeah, it's the cliff effect.
The cliff effect.
Yeah, yeah. No, but but I knew exactly what you were talking about, and this is something that I think what you've put your finger on here, Rick, is something so important that I think this work group does need to talk about it, and we do need to see if AIR may be able to address this, because I think this is a structural concern about the current cost model.
Thank you, Dave. Yes, and we work, you and I, with Jen and with the folks at the LBA trying to address that.
Yep.
Drew, without going into great detail here, is that something that in a written form AIR could advise us on? Meaning, what would it take for you to do an analysis that was linear as opposed to categorical?
Or graduated. For the first 200 students, you get this weight. The next 800 students, you get this weight. So that you don't fall off a cliff. You don't say like, well, we can't take that 200th student in our district.
There is that kind of effect. I mean, he's got it up until, right. There's steps from 200 to. Anyway.
Right. But does the total ADM, does it click away through the steps, or does it all go into a single?
Yeah, right now it all goes into a single category. So you're right that there is a step off when you go from 200 to 201. I think that there are ways that you could address that through hold harmless provisions, or if a district was 199 last year and now this year they're 201, you could keep them in the less than 200 category for a year. and see if their enrollment changes again the next year. So, I mean, there's things that you could do in terms of that, but I also agree that there are ways that you could model it so that it's more that smooth out those steps. And I'll have to talk with the rest of the AIR team to think about how much effort that would take to think about that and to advise the commission on that. But yeah, I mean, there are options that could be taken.
Good. I think we need to do that. The step at 200 is 38%. The step at 2,000 is 10%. So there is a linear path here. But Drew, let's take that question to another day and see what AIR's proposal would be to do that.
I'm glad to hear you saying that, Jay, because when we were looking at equalized valuation per pupil and providing differentiated or disparity aid to them, we started at $1 million and worked our way down, and we got rid of those cliffs that we once had when we had this, the old formula from 2009 had those cliffs in it. And even though we were funding at different weights, there are huge, huge cliffs, and we need to have more of a slide effect.
Yep. Dick Ames.
Thank you. Just on this last point, I'd certainly be against cliffs and going to some kind of model that is a slope. But that's not what I wanted to talk about or ask about, really. So I'm philosophically with someone else used the word philosophical, so I'll use it too. Philosophically with this approach, this outcome-based approach. I think it makes a lot of sense. It all hangs together and seems to direct funding and assessment of funding need in the right direction to those places that sort of common sense tells me would need the most. So that's all to the good. My question is, what does it signify? In the AIR report, and maybe this is obvious to everybody, I don't know. The part of the report is at page 29 and 28, where you transition from all the modeling you've done into costing it out, getting into your formula. You speak of the cost of adequacy and talk about estimating the cost of providing an adequate education. And I just, the question is this formula, this build off from outcomes that are the state average to an analysis of differential student needs that need to be costed out to a formula, lead us to, in each school district, to a cost of adequacy for that school district that is constitutional. So is the word being used in that sense? That's my question.
To me, or open question to the
it's an open question. What did you have in mind, Drew, when you wrote this up as the cost of adequacy?
And I think we're using a more functional definition of adequacy in terms of how we laid it out, using the state average outcome and justifying that based on New Hampshire's standing in the nation and among New England states. I'm not a New Hampshire constitutional scholar, but I would think that it would be hard to sell something less than the state average as something that's adequate. But I'm not sure.
Let me try the operative phrase is the opportunity for an adequate education. And the opportunity is measured in terms of the outcome. And we are driving to an average outcome. And that is a different approach than the way that we've come at this before. When we truncate the opportunity for an adequate education, we're focusing on just an adequate education like it's an input measure, like you can actually build it up for the same cost for each student, or the small weights that we apply. And this is putting, this is an emphasis on a student. What does it cost to educate a student to a common educational outcome in the state? And you know, it'll fall to the districts as it does, but the emphasis is on the student. And as we've said, this is educating all our kids to that common educational outcome. Done.
Can I follow? Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Bill.
Can I follow Dick's question and your reply? I want to just make kind of the argument that people who have participated in this process might make. They would say, I appreciate all that mumbo jumbo. But I'm doing this as trying to lighten it up. But if the cost per pupil that's determined by this formula is $21,000 per pupil in Manchester and $14,000 a pupil in Wolfboro, say, then under the particular reading first and last dollar that is applied by some people in the past, that the court has said, that the state budget, not any local government budget, the state budget must pay every dollar of that resulting dollar cost. By the way, Jay, I agree with you. I think there's a real quality outcome-based adequacy argument here that has not been made before, and that will have a big impact practically in the constitutional world. But I think that we have to address the fact that there are many people who are stuck in the mold that says, and Rick Ladd pointed to the annotation from the Londonderry case earlier today at 10 o'clock. It says, once you decide how much it is, the state budget has to pay for it, every dollar. So I just wanted to reply and say that I think Dick's raised, and I agree with him. This is really critical that we directly address this as a commission, and that we say that we directly say why we believe our holistic approach that's based on the AIR number, looking at the functional meaning of adequacy as a whole, and the local input plus the state input, that we're achieving something that's better for children across the whole state. And we have to take that on. So thank you. I agree with the concern, and I think we have to address it.
And I think you've made a good point, Dick, as well. And there needs to be that opportunity to examine how this model fits within the judicial findings that we've had to date. And it'll be interesting to, on September 24th, to also hear the arguments that both parties are going to put forward to the court, which I assume they've already submitted, but it'll be interesting to hear the court's questions for that. Anybody else? We've got a few minutes left. Further comments?
So Jay, just I don't want to take up, you've got 4 minutes. I want to take up 30 seconds. Just to follow on what Bill was saying, what you were saying, we had a conversation this morning during the 10 o'clock work group on this very question. And I think we had a good sort of conversation on it. We weren't debating it. We weren't, taking sides on an issue. But Carsey School, as one of their roles here, is to help us with analysis. So they're going to brief it. This is for the first and last dollar. Let me say it another way. What is the state obligation? Is it first and last dollar? Is it something else? Maybe that's the way it's titled. And they're going to brief it based on everything we've heard from January until now, and then we're going to discuss it. And I think we keep Drew on. Drew, AIR does not have to weigh in on the state's responsibility for education dollars. I think you've laid out a really honest approach to how to estimate educational costs, and it's up to us to figure out the rest of that. But getting an answer, getting at least our answer. It's not going to be our constitutional answer, but our answer to this. Then I think we'll be able to proceed and complete our work. So,
Iris.
Yeah, I agree with Bill that we need to address this issue. I don't really think that people who continue to believe there is a state obligation for first and last dollar are stuck. I think it's a different viewpoint. And I would like that analysis. It's great to hear that you're doing that in that work group, and Carsey's doing that work for you. I'd like to have that question put out for public comment and see what happens.
That's a brilliant idea.
Yeah, we can probably set that up for one of our extended comment days.
And we can also, if we can arrive at a question that's sort of a lay version of the question, because there's a lot behind that. We can pose it in our focus groups.
Yeah, I'm interested in people who would not need to have it translated into lay language also. I would like to hear from some experts with some history on the issue.
Right, and we've already heard we've gotten good input in early commission meetings from the Department of Justice, from Ann Edwards, from Daniel Will. We also heard from plaintiffs' attorneys, Michael Tierney, and so on. So we'll resurrect a lot of that input.
That's true.
Sorry?
But the difference, Bruce, is that all that discussion was kind of generic. It was pre the AIR concept being laid out in a tangible way. Now we have, I'd like to hear whether people believe the AIR simulation model as it stands, even though that wasn't the recommendation of the committee, does that pass their view of the constitutional test? And invite people to make comment on that and see what kind of controversy it brings.
So let's say, maybe the contribution that folks might be able to make is, and who would be that audience? Because those people that are committed to a case are not going to be the unbiased opinions. And first off, we aren't going to get one from the Department of Justice or Attorney General's office. And those who are defending, an input-based formula and the relative amounts, they're not going to take a position either. So who do we go to that we haven't already tried to approach? And I think that would be helpful. Was there somebody else? I'm wanting to if we are, so is that question, does that need to precede the recommendation about an outcomes-based measure of the opportunity for an adequate education? That was and I don't think in the minute that we're over, we're going to take the straw poll, but I think this group needs to set its positions before the full commission next week. This question really is the acceptance of the report. And I think, we don't have necessarily the words as to how to tweak the statutory language, but we have a concept, and that's just my feeling that this work group has been asked by the committee to make that kind of statement.
So Jay, I think the report includes the estimated cost model.
Correct.
I think we've got some work we've got to do on that. We've got to hear back from AIR on what it would take to smooth out the school size weighting factor. And I think we've also talked about maybe double checking some you know, some of the how the school size is being done, particularly in districts that may operate. I'm sorry, in towns that operate their own elementary school, but then go co-op for maybe high school, let's say, and really get an understanding of that. And I think we suggested at the public engagement work group just preceding this that maybe some of our members that have a lot of experience with specific school districts, cities, and towns can take a look at those numbers and see if they sort of line up with their experience. So Dave Ryan in particular, his SAU is a pretty complex one. So.
And Dave, is the co-op school district issue that I flagged being addressed? You know, the co-op districts have member towns, and the allocation of costs to the towns is different from any formula we're going to develop.
I think that was looked. I think we looked in. Drew, did
I've had no feedback on it.
I had a short email conversation with Bruce Mallory about it, and I think my short answer was that there are complexities that the simulator itself is not necessarily fit to address, and if you want to address that, I think it would be kind of outside the simulator as a separate sheet, and it's up in the air as to whether the commission wants to just handle the completion of that spreadsheet that you started, Dick, on its own, or whether AIR should officially incorporate that into the simulator. If it's not incorporated into the simulator, I'd be happy to add a note to the documentation that explains the limitation with respect to co-op districts. But just to let you all know, our AIR contract is ending shortly, and we have a specific number of hours that we have left to complete everything that we need to do, including finalizing the report. And so we just need to think carefully about how we prioritize our remaining time to serve the commission the best way that we can.
And just for information of folks on this call, we're now in conversation with Jesse about extending that consulting agreement to allow for exactly this kind of additional work. No decision's been made yet, but that's on the table, and we'll probably have a resolution on that within the next day or two.
And that'll come back to the commission, and you'll recall back in March, April, May, that there's a provision in the contract with them for additional hours post report. So.
We're rapidly
Jay.
So we'll need to look at that.
Bill.
Jay, I think I hear what you're saying. If what we need to do as an adequacy work group is say to the commission that we believe there should be, as Mel described it earlier, this revolutionary shift from the way we've done it in the past, which is input-based, to an outcomes approach to defining adequacy, I think I've not heard one person say they don't support that. Now remember, just that concept alone doesn't raise the constitutional issue. The constitutional issue comes up kind of in the guts of the model. And so I think, you know, I haven't heard anyone on this group say that they wouldn't support that fundamental shift. Some of the details on cooperative stuff, some of the details, you know, Massachusetts, did a commission like in 2015, it took them 4 years to crunch all the details about cooperatives, about cliffs,
Right.
about all of those issues that get done before they passed a revised law. And so I think that the concept is something that I'm perfectly prepared and when you, the leadership, think it's necessary, I'm ready to vote for that myself. It's just the guts of it still out.
Yeah, I want to answer Jay's question as a member of the committee too. I agree with Bill that in concept we're ready. I think your agenda language about E2B, the alternative language, I'd like an opportunity to actually discuss that. I
agree.
It wasn't around it.
I do too.
But I do differentiate that and the willingness to work on a way of expressing it there that expresses agreement with this concept shift. But I don't think I'm ready to embrace the AIR report with its recommendations for specific weights or all of the other details that Bill was just alluding to. I'm not ready to do that. I don't feel like I've had an opportunity to fully discuss the weights and where they come from and their varying applications and the things that are not considered, such as the fiscal capacity regarding small schools and the concentration issues. I mean, I think there's a whole lot left to discuss.
Yeah.
So I'm not ready to tell the commission that I embrace the report and want to see it translated as is into legislation. I'm not there yet.
Okay, so I think so that we space the discussions properly and schedule the right number of discussions, if members can write those questions, just as Iris was describing, I think, and Bruce, if you could describe the task that each of us has for homework so that we can talk specifically about do we move from the linear model on ELL, for instance, which is what we have now, to a concentration model. What does it do to our overall concept? The question about size of district, can that be put to a linear test as opposed to the categorical cliffs that or measures that we've got? And there's a question about the transportation funding, and then I throw out just one more that we haven't talked about yet, and that's we haven't applied inflation indices to this. So we're kind of talking about a 2019 price to the cost per student, but in fact, we're going to be putting this out to a legislature that's looking at 22, 23 costs. And we haven't discussed that. How would we get to that place in our discussions with people? Because it's going to push it over $20,000, and there are cliffs to people's mental connotations that they put to numbers. Anyway, but we do need to talk about inflation because it's something that the AIR model will allow us to include, but is not there yet. Okay, even if there are other questions like that, let's tee them up so we give enough time.
Well, yeah, just so if people could send that to me as an email, not copied all, so we don't get into an online deliberation. But I'll collect those and categorize them and then share them back out. I need to break off myself.
Yep.
Likewise. All right.
At this point.
Good for today. Thank you all. Good discussion. Thank you.
All right. See you all.
Sure, we'll see you tomorrow at that 11 o'clock meeting.